Valara Sorin stood in her private chambers on the highest floor of her father's palace and stared at the holographic image floating above her desk. It showed a man, a human man. He had short dark hair, a square jaw, and calm brown eyes that looked straight ahead as if the camera did not bother him at all. His name was Cole Hartley. He held the rank of lieutenant commander in the Earth Unified Fleet, and in 3 days she was going to marry him. She turned the image off and walked to the window. Below her, the crystal spires of Serath Prime stretched toward the sky like frozen pillars of light. Floating gardens drifted between the towers, carrying the scent of blooming night flowers across the city. This was the capital of the Aethori Dominion, one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the Galactic Council. Her people had ruled these stars for 12,000 years. They had built empires, written laws that governed half the galaxy, and fought wars that lesser species only read about in history files. And now her father wanted her to bond herself to a human. Humans had only been part of the Galactic Council for 40 years. 40 years. That was barely a breath in the life of the Aethori. Most Council species viewed humans as newcomers who had stumbled into the stars by accident. They were short-lived, loud, and possessed none of the grace or discipline that defined the elder civilizations. They held a single junior seat on the council. Their opinion carried almost no weight. And yet Grand Arbiter Falvine, her own father, had arranged this bonding ceremony as if it were just another trade agreement. Valara was not heartbroken. She was insulted. She had been raised in the finest academies on Serath Prime. She spoke 6 galactic languages. She had trained in diplomacy, political strategy, and the old ceremonial arts that the Aethori had practiced for thousands of years. If she was to be bonded, she had expected it to be with someone worthy of her standing, an Aethori lord, perhaps, or at the very least, a high-ranking dignitary from one of the senior council species. Instead, her father had chosen a human soldier with no family connections, no political influence, and no particular reputation. He had been selected, she was told, specifically because he was unremarkable, expendable, a token to seal a minor military cooperation agreement. The day Cole Hartley arrived on Serath Prime, the sky was clear and the twin suns hung low over the crystal towers. Valara watched from a balcony as his transport shuttle landed on the platform below. It was a small plain vessel, nothing like the ornate ships the Aethori used for diplomatic arrivals. The ramp lowered, and 3 humans walked out. He wore a simple, dark dress uniform, with no decorations beyond his rank insignia. He was tall for a human, but still shorter than most Aethori. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace that did not look around for approval or react to the dozens of Aethori officials waiting in their elaborate ceremonial robes. Behind him came 2 others, a broad-shouldered man with a wide grin, who Valara would later learn was Danny Price, and a sharp-eyed woman named Katie Grant, who carried a datapad and scanned everything around her with quiet intensity. The Aethori welcoming delegation barely hid their contempt. Their smiles were thin, and their bows were shallow. Danny muttered something to Katie that made her shake her head and tell him to be quiet. The formal introduction took place in the grand reception hall, a vast chamber with walls of living crystal that shifted color with the mood of the room. Valara descended the main staircase in traditional bonding robes of pale silver and stood before Cole Hartley for the first time. He was close enough for her to see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes and the steadiness in his gaze. He did not stare at her with awe or nervousness. He simply looked at her the way one looks at someone they intend to treat with respect. He introduced himself with a short, clear greeting. He acknowledged the arrangement without complaint or false enthusiasm. And then he asked her a question that no one in the room expected. He asked her if there was anything she needed from him to make the transition easier. Velara had prepared herself for arrogance, or awkwardness, or the clumsy attempts at charm that she had heard humans were known for. She had not prepared for simple, honest courtesy. She answered with the minimum required by protocol, and moved on. But the question stayed in her mind longer than she wanted it to. The bonding ceremony took place 3 days later, in the Hall of Eternal Light, the most sacred ceremonial space on Serath Prime. Thousands of Aethori watched in person, and billions more watched through broadcast networks. It was treated as a grand event by the public, a symbol of the Dominion's growing alliances. Behind the scenes, it was cold and mechanical. Grand Arbiter Thalvine did not attend in person. He sent a holographic projection that delivered the ceremonial blessing with the warmth of a legal document. Velara stood beside Cole through the entire ceremony, with her chin held high and her expression carved from stone. Cole stood beside her with the same quiet composure he had shown since he arrived. After the ceremony, they were assigned shared quarters in a diplomatic compound on the outskirts of the capital. Their early days together were stiff and distant. Velara spoke to Cole only when necessary, and treated him with the careful politeness one might show a guest who had overstayed their welcome. Cole did not push her. He kept to his own routines, maintained his own space, and began his actual work, meeting with Aethori military liaisons to coordinate border defense protocols that were the real reason for the alliance. Katie Grant, meanwhile, had started picking up strange signals in the intelligence networks. Reports from the Outer Rim spoke of colony systems going silent without explanation. She found references to the Vraxian Horde, a brutal insectoid empire that the Council had officially declared contained decades ago, but the new data did not match that classification at all. When she tried to share her findings with Aethori intelligence, she was met with polite refusals and closed doors. One evening, late at night, Velara could not sleep. She walked through the compound and past the training room. Through the observation window, she saw Cole alone inside. He was running combat drills against a holographic sparring system. She recognized the program. It was the one the Aethori Special Forces use for their highest qualification level. Most Aethori soldiers took months to pass it. Cole was moving through the sequences with a speed and precision that made it look effortless. Every strike was exact. Every movement flowed into the next without pause or hesitation. There was no wasted energy, no showmanship. Just a quiet, terrifying efficiency that she had never seen in any warrior of any species. She watched him for a long time. When she finally turned and walked back to her chambers, she realized that she did not understand the man she had married, and for the first time, that bothered her. The crystal spires of Serath Prime were still standing when Cole Hartley returned to them, though nothing else felt the same. The city had not been touched by the war. Its towers still caught the light of the twin suns and scattered it in pale rainbows across the floating gardens. Its streets were still filled with Aethori citizens going about their ancient routines. But the world had changed around the city, and everyone who lived in it knew it. Cole was recovering from his wounds in the diplomatic compound where his marriage had begun months ago. The Aethori had offered him a suite in the Palace District, a place of honor reserved for dignitaries of the highest standing. He had turned it down. The compound was familiar, and Cole had never been a man who needed monuments built around him. His left arm was wrapped in a regenerative cast that the Aethori medical team had applied with far more care and attention than they would have shown him a year ago. The wound was deep but clean, and the doctors said it would heal fully. The bruises and smaller cuts had already faded. The exhaustion had not. He had slept for nearly 2 full days after returning to Serath Prime, and when he woke, he found Velara sitting in a chair by the window, reading something on a datapad and waiting for him. She had not left his side since the Forge of Sarathi. Their relationship was different now, and both of them knew it, though neither of them had tried to define it with words. The distance that had stood between them for months was gone. It had not been torn down in a dramatic moment of confession or passion. It had simply dissolved, worn away by shared danger and quiet acts of courage, and the slow realization that what they had was no longer a political arrangement. It was something real. Velara understood Cole now in a way she had not thought possible when she first saw his holographic image in her chambers. She understood that the quiet, steady man she had dismissed as unremarkable was in fact the most remarkable person she had ever known. Not because of the title the galaxy had given him, but because of the choices he made when no one was watching. He had asked her, on the day they met, if there was anything he could do to make things easier for her. And he had spent every day since then living by that same principle, applied not just to her, but to everyone around him. He did not fight for glory. He did not lead for power. He simply saw what needed to be done and did it, and he did it so well that the galaxy had mistaken his competence for divinity. The political aftermath of the war reshaped the Galactic Council in ways that would take decades to fully understand. Humanity's status was transformed overnight. Earth was offered a senior seat on the Council, a position that came with real authority and a voice in every major decision. Human military doctrine, the aggressive, adaptive, asymmetric style of warfare that Cole had demonstrated at the Draven Corridor, became the foundation for a new combined defense strategy that the Council adopted as standard. Human officers were suddenly in demand at every military academy in Council space, not as curiosities, but as instructors. The Aethori Dominion handled the shift with the dignity and discomfort of a proud civilization being forced to reconsider its assumptions. They had spent 12,000 years at the center of galactic power, and they had always viewed other species through the lens of their own superiority. The war had not destroyed that belief entirely, but it had cracked it open in a way that could not be repaired. They had watched a human save them. They had watched their own daughter bond with that human. And they had watched their carefully maintained image of dominance dissolve in the fire of a battle that they could not have won alone. Grand Arbiter Thalvine summoned Cole for a private audience in his personal chambers in the palace. It was only the second time the two men had been in the same room. Thalvine was ancient by any standard, his silver skin lined with the faint patterns that marked extreme age among the Aethori. He sat across from Cole and studied him with the sharp, calculating eyes that had guided the Dominion through centuries of political maneuvering. He told Cole that he had arranged the bonding ceremony expecting nothing more than a minor strategic advantage. He said he had chosen Cole specifically because he believed a human of no particular importance would be easy to control and easy to discard when the arrangement was no longer useful. He did not use the word apology. The Aethori language did not have a word for it that carried the same weight that humans gave it. But the acknowledgement was there, heavy and unmistakable. Cole listened and nodded and said nothing about the insult that the arrangement had originally been. He had never cared about the politics. He had cared about doing the work and about the woman he had come to love, and now both of those things were safe. That was enough. Doran Hale was quietly removed from his diplomatic position. No public announcement was made, and no formal charges were filed, but everyone who mattered understood why. His efforts to undermine the human alliance and discredit Cole's intelligence about the Vraxian threat had nearly cost the Council its survival. He disappeared into obscurity on a minor Aethori colony world, and no one mourned his absence. Danny Price recovered from his injuries aboard a medical ship in orbit around Sarath Prime. His left leg had been rebuilt with synthetic bone, and the doctors told him he would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life. Danny said the limp made him look distinguished. When Cole visited him, the two men sat together for a while in the kind of comfortable silence that only people who have nearly died together can share. Danny eventually broke it by telling Cole that he owed him a new ship. Cole told him to file a requisition form. Danny laughed so hard that the medical monitor next to his bed started beeping in alarm. Katie Grant was offered the leadership of a newly created Joint Intelligence Division that would be responsible for monitoring threats across all of Council space. She accepted the position immediately and was already drafting operational plans before the official paperwork was complete. She had spent months watching the Council ignore her warnings, and she had no intention of letting that happen again. On a quiet evening, a few weeks after the battle, Cole and Velara stood together on the balcony of their quarters in the diplomatic compound. The crystal spires of the city rose around them, glowing softly in the light of the setting suns. Ships moved across the sky in steady streams, carrying supplies and personnel for the ongoing operations against the scattered remnants of the Vraxian horde. The war was not over. The remaining horde clusters would take years to hunt down, but the worst had passed, and the galaxy was beginning to breathe again. Velara leaned against the railing and looked out at the city she had grown up in. After a long silence, she told Cole that when she had first seen his image on that holographic display in her chambers, she had believed her father was punishing her. She told him that she had stood at that same window and felt nothing but resentment for the arrangements she had been forced into. Cole stood beside her, and with the understated humor that Velara had come to recognize as one of the most human things about him, told her that he had felt the same way. Velara smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real, and Cole had learned to value her real smiles because she gave them so rarely. She asked him what came next. Cole looked out at the sky, at the vast, dark expanse of stars that now knew what humanity was capable of, and told her that what came next was the same thing that always came next. They would rebuild. They would prepare. And if something came again to threaten what they had built, they would fight again. Because that was what humans did. Velara reached out and took his hand. Among the Aethori, the act of taking someone's hand carried a meaning deeper than words. It was a declaration, a promise, a bond that went beyond ceremony or politics. It meant that the person standing beside you was chosen, not assigned. She told him that she had not chosen this marriage, but if she had been given every choice in the galaxy, she would choose him now. Cole held her hand and said nothing, because there are moments where silence is the only language that fits, and they stood together on that balcony as the suns went down and the stars came out. Across the galaxy, in the military academies and war colleges of a dozen species, instructors began teaching the Battle of the Draven Corridor. They studied the tactics, the logistics, the impossible 9-day defense that should not have worked, and did. Students from every species sat in lecture halls and reviewed the data and asked the same question, over and over again. How did one human do this? The answer, which the instructors were only beginning to understand, was that Cole Hartley had never been just one human. He carried his entire species with him. Every war they had fought, every lesson they had learned in blood, every time they had been beaten to the ground and had gotten back up, simply because they did not know how to stay down. He had not ascended as a god of war because he was superhuman. He had ascended because he was perfectly, completely, and unapologetically human, and the galaxy would never forget it. Cole Hartley had weeks, not months, to prepare for the end of the world. He established his command center aboard the Forge of Serafi, a massive Aethori battle station that orbited a dying star on the edge of Council space. The station had been built centuries ago as a symbol of military power, but it had never been tested in a real war. Cole repurposed it from a monument into a weapon. He stripped away the ceremonial halls and converted them into tactical operations rooms. He rerouted power from decorative systems to shield generators and communication arrays. He turned the forge into the nerve center of the largest combined fleet the galaxy had ever seen. Danny Price commanded the human contingent. 47 warships, including the battered but repaired Steadfast. Katie Grant ran the intelligence operation from a sealed room deep inside the station, surrounded by screens that showed every sensor feed and intercepted signal from across the sector. And Valera, using every political connection she had, worked behind the scenes to keep the Alliance from tearing itself apart under the pressure of fear. Cole chose his battlefield carefully. The Draven Corridor was a narrow channel of navigable space, squeezed between two massive nebulae. Any fleet passing through it would be forced into a compressed formation, unable to spread out or flank. For the Vraxian horde, whose greatest advantage was their overwhelming numbers, the corridor was a trap. They would have to come through it in waves, and Cole intended to break every wave that came. The Vraxian arrived on the 9th day of the 3rd month. Long-range sensors showed them first as a wall of light on the display screens. Thousands of energy signatures packed so tightly together that they blurred into a single burning line. As they drew closer, the individual signatures resolved into ships. Massive bioships covered in dark chitinous armor. Carrier vessels that swarmed with fighter drones. And at the center, barely visible behind the wall of warships, the colossal flagship of Warlord Kezarak, the ancient commander who had never lost a campaign in his 200-year career. The Battle of the Draven Corridor began at dawn by station time, and it did not stop for 9 days. Cole commanded from the central operations room of the Forge, standing before a holographic display that showed the entire battlefield in real time. He did not sit down for the first 40 hours. He rotated fresh units to the front line in continuous waves, pulling damaged ships back for rapid repair and sending rested crews forward before the Vraxian could build momentum. He deployed human-designed electronic warfare systems that broadcast interference into the Horde's Hive communication network, the biological signal that allowed Vraxian ships to coordinate as a single organism. When the interference hit, entire sections of the Horde fleet stuttered and lost cohesion, ships colliding with each other or firing on empty space. He used the Telvari Engineering Corps to construct gravity mines in the field, devices that generated localized gravitational wells strong enough to pull Vraxian ships off course and fracture their formations into isolated pockets. Once a pocket was cut off from the main fleet, Cole sent strike groups to destroy it before the Horde could reorganize. The Vraxian adapted, because the Vraxian always adapted. They shifted their communication frequencies. They sent expendable drone ships ahead to trigger the gravity mines. They increased the density of their assault waves, throwing more ships into the corridor with each push. But every time they adapted, Cole adapted faster. He changed tactics between engagements, sometimes between individual maneuvers, keeping the enemy off balance in a way that no species in the galaxy had ever managed against the Horde. The Aethori officers in the command room watched him with something beyond respect. Valara saw it on their faces. These were veterans who had served in military campaigns for centuries, and they were watching a man do things with a fleet that they had never imagined possible. He did not fight like an Aethori commander, with careful plans and measured responses. He fought like a storm, always moving, always striking, always one step ahead of an enemy that outnumbered him 10-1. On the 5th day, Warlord Kezarak recognized Cole as the primary threat. Kezarak was old and patient, and very, very intelligent. He understood that the defense should have collapsed days ago. The fact that it had not meant that something extraordinary was commanding the enemy fleet. He pulled his elite guard fleet, 500 of the most powerful warships in the Horde, out of the main formation, and sent them on a direct course for the Forge of Sarathi. The assault on the station was devastating. The elite guard hit the forge like a hammer, overwhelming the outer defense perimeter and breaching the hull in 3 places. Vraxian boarding parties poured into the station. Massive insectoid warriors with armored exoskeletons and razor-sharp limbs, each one standing over 8 feet tall. Cole left the command center. He had no choice. If the station fell, the entire defense would collapse. He gathered a squad of human marines and a group of Aethori soldiers and went to meet the enemy in the corridors of the forge. What happened next became legend. The alien soldiers fighting alongside Cole had studied humans. They had read reports about human combat capability. They thought they understood. Cole moved through those corridors like something out of a nightmare. The Vraxian warriors were bigger, stronger, and covered in natural armor that could stop energy blasts. Cole killed them with speed, with precision, with an instinct for violence so deep and so refined that it did not look learned. It looked like something that had been bred into his species over 1,000,000 years of evolution. He fired, moved, struck, adapted, every action flowing into the next without thought or hesitation. The Aethori soldiers behind him fought bravely, but they were following his lead, reacting to his rhythm, surviving because he was cutting a path through the enemy that they only had to widen. During the fighting, a Vraxian breach team cut through a section of the station and isolated Velara from the main group. She was trapped in a sealed corridor with 2 Aethori guards who were quickly overwhelmed by the attacking warriors. Cole heard the report over his communication link. He turned, without a word, and fought his way back through an entire corridor of Vraxian soldiers to reach her. When he arrived, he was bleeding from a wound on his left arm. His armor was cracked. His face was covered in the dark ichor of the Vraxian dead. He stepped through the doorway, saw Velara pressed against the far wall with a fallen energy weapon in her hand, and confirmed that she was unharmed with a single glance. Then he turned around and kept fighting. Velara stood in that corridor with the sounds of battle raging around her, and understood something that changed everything she believed about the man she had married. He had not fought through those soldiers because of duty, not because of the alliance, not because of any political arrangement. He had done it because she mattered to him, and she understood, in that moment, that when a human decided something mattered, there was no force in the universe that could stand in the way. The battle reached its climax on the 9th day. The Vraxian fleet was battered, but still fighting, still pushing, still pouring ships into the corridor with the mindless determination of a species that did not understand surrender. Cole needed to break them, not just hold them. He ordered Danny Price to lead the Steadfast and a wedge of volunteer ships from every species in the fleet on a strike run directly into the heart of the Vraxian formation. The target was Kezerak's flagship. Danny did not hesitate. He had known Cole since basic training on Earth, and he had never once seen Cole ask for something that was not absolutely necessary. The Steadfast led the charge. It punched through the Vraxian lines, with the volunteer ships forming a protective wedge around it, absorbing fire from every direction. Crews died, but the wedge held together long enough for the Steadfast to reach weapons range of the flagship and deliver a concentrated barrage that tore through its hull and crippled its command systems. Danny survived. The Steadfast was a broken wreck, drifting in the void, but the crew was pulled out alive. With Kezerak's flagship silent and the Hive communication network severed, the Vraxian horde lost its mind. The fleet did not retreat. The Vraxian had no concept of retreat, but it shattered into disorganized clusters that fought without coordination or purpose. Cole's defense fleet, exhausted and bleeding but still standing, moved in and began to destroy them piece by piece. The Battle of the Draven Corridor was over. In the days that followed, as reports of the victory spread across every world in Council space, the alien species who had watched a human hold the line against the largest invasion in galactic history began to use a new word for Cole Hartley. It was a title that did not translate perfectly into most languages, but its meaning was clear: the God of War. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Cole Hartley's life, and none of them involved combat. He fought on two fronts at once. The first was political. Together with Katie Grant, he assembled an overwhelming body of evidence about the Vraxian invasion: sensor data, intercepted communications, refugee testimonies, fleet movement projections, and presented it to every council delegation willing to listen. Some believed him. The smaller species with colonies on the outer rim were terrified, because they understood that they would be the first to burn. But the larger powers were skeptical. The Vraxian horde had been classified as contained for decades, and admitting that classification was wrong meant admitting that the Council's intelligence apparatus had failed catastrophically. Nobody wanted to be the one to say that out loud. Ambassador Doran Hale made things worse. He moved quietly through diplomatic channels, spreading the idea that the humans were exaggerating the threat to increase their own standing within the Council. It was a clever lie, because it played on what most species already believed: that humans were ambitious newcomers looking for any opportunity to grab more power. Hale never said it directly. He simply asked careful questions in the right rooms. Can we really trust intelligence gathered by a species that has only been in space for a few decades? He would say. Is it possible that Lieutenant Commander Hartley sees a larger threat because it serves his career to see one? Valera discovered what Hale was doing through her own network of political contacts. She had spent her entire life in the Aethori political world, and she knew how to read the currents of power better than almost anyone. When she traced the source of the doubt back to Hale, she confronted him privately in a corridor outside the council chambers. She told him, in the cold, precise tone that the Aethori used when they were truly dangerous, that if his interference led to the council being unprepared for the invasion, every death that followed would carry his name. Hale backed off slightly after that, but he did not stop entirely. Men like Hale never stopped until they were forced to. The second front was military. Cole began doing something that had never been attempted in the history of the Galactic Council. He started training mixed-species combat units. He gathered volunteers from the Aethori military, from the Telvari, a smaller allied species with a natural talent for engineering, and from the human forces. He brought them together in a training compound on the outskirts of Sereth Prime, and began drilling them as a single fighting force. The Aethori soldiers were proud and formal. They followed rigid doctrines that had been refined over centuries, and they did not take kindly to being told by a human that those doctrines needed to change. The Telvari were clever, but physically small, and they had never been frontline fighters. The humans were aggressive and adaptable, but lacked the patience that long-lived species considered essential. Cole handled each group differently. With the Aethori, he was patient and methodical, showing respect for their traditions while gradually introducing new ideas. With the Telvari, he was energetic and collaborative, giving them problems to solve and then stepping back to let their engineering minds find solutions he would never have thought of himself. With the humans, he was direct and demanding, because that was the language they understood best. Some of them openly questioned why they were taking orders from a species that had been flying starships for less than a century. Cole did not argue with them. Instead, he proved himself. He ran every drill alongside his soldiers. He completed every exercise at the same difficulty level he demanded from them. And when the Aethori Special Forces qualification course was set up as a benchmark, Cole finished it faster than any Aethori in the compound. He did not boast about it. He did not even mention it. He simply posted the results and moved on to the next training session. The HFY soldiers noticed, and slowly, grudgingly, the resistance began to fade. Velara started attending the training sessions. She told herself it was political curiosity. She needed to understand what her husband was doing, so she could manage the diplomatic implications. But the truth was that she found herself fascinated. She watched Cole take a group of soldiers who could barely stand to be in the same room together, and turn them into something that moved and fought as one. She watched him adapt, compromise, and push in exactly the right measure for each species, each individual, each moment. She began to understand that what she had mistaken for simplicity in Cole was actually something much rarer. It was clarity. He saw through the noise of politics and pride and cultural difference to the thing that actually mattered, and then he moved toward it without hesitation. Their relationship changed during this time, not in any dramatic way. There was no single moment where everything shifted. Instead, it happened in small pieces. Velara started asking Cole about Earth. She asked about human history, about why his species fought the way it did. Cole told her the truth without romanticizing it. He told her that humans had been at war with each other for as long as they had existed. That, their entire history, was a long, bloody record of conflict after conflict, interrupted by brief periods of peace that never lasted. He told her that this constant fighting had shaped his species in ways that most galactic civilizations could not understand, because most of them had achieved internal peace before they ever reached the stars. Velara asked him if that history frightened him, the idea that his people were defined by violence. Cole thought about it for a moment, and then said that violence did not define humans. What defined them was the refusal to stop. He said that humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy, or the smartest, or the most advanced, but they might be the most stubborn. And sometimes, when everything else failed, stubborn was enough. Velara remembered those words. She would remember them for the rest of her life. The turning point came when a Vraxian probe fleet struck the Calori system, far closer to Council core space than any projection had predicted. The Council defense fleet scrambled to respond, but their tactics were textbook. Predictable formations, standard engagement patterns, everything by the doctrine that had served them well against civilized opponents. The Vraxian did not fight like civilized opponents. They adapted in real time, shifting their formations to exploit every gap, every hesitation, every moment of confusion in the defense line. The Council fleet began to crumble. Cole was not in command. He was monitoring the battle from Calorith Station, alongside a room full of HFY officers. He began sending tactical recommendations to the fleet commander through back channels, suggestions for maneuvers that broke every rule in the standard playbook. At first, his suggestions were ignored. Then, as losses mounted and the defense line buckled, the fleet commander began listening. Cole guided them through a series of moves that no Council strategist would have considered. He told them to feign a retreat on the left flank to draw the Vraxian into a pocket. He told them to overload their shield generators and use the energy burst as a weapon. He told them to send their fastest ships behind the enemy line and attack from a direction the Vraxian had already cleared. It worked. The battle turned. The Vraxian probe fleet was destroyed, though the cost was high. After the battle, Grand Arbiter Thalvine summoned Cole to a private chamber on Sereth Prime. Velara was present. Her father looked at Cole with eyes that had weighed the fate of civilizations for centuries, and made an offer that no human had ever received. He gave Cole joint command of a combined Council defense fleet, the largest multi-species military force ever assembled. The catch was obvious. If Cole failed, humanity would be blamed. If he succeeded, the HFY would take the credit. Cole accepted without a moment of hesitation. When they were alone afterward, Velara told Cole that her father was using him. Cole nodded. He said he knew. She asked why he accepted. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes, and said that being used and being useful were not always different things. What mattered was not who received the credit, but whether people survived. Velara stared at him for a long time. Then she nodded slowly and said nothing more. But something in her chest shifted, something warm and quiet and unexpected, and she did not push it away. That night, the long-range sensor arrays lit up with a signal that made every officer on Galactic Station go pale. The main Vraxian Horde fleet had been detected. It stretched across light years of space, thousands upon thousands of warships moving in a formation so vast it looked like a dark tide rolling through the stars. The invasion had truly begun, and the galaxy was looking at Cole Hartley to stop it. 3 months passed, and the marriage of Cole Hartley and Velara Sorin settled into a pattern that was polite, predictable, and empty. They shared meals when protocol required it. They attended diplomatic functions together, and stood side by side, like two strangers who happened to be walking in the same direction. Velara had learned a few things about him in that time. He woke early, he trained every day without exception, and he never complained about anything. But she had not learned who he was, because she had not tried to. That changed at the summit on Galactic Station. Galactic was a massive orbital platform that served as a neutral meeting ground for the Galactic Council. Delegations from a dozen species had gathered to discuss resource distribution along the outer rim, and Cole attended as part of the small human advisory team. Velara accompanied him because the bonding agreement required her presence at major political events. She expected nothing more than another dull day of speeches and negotiations. The distress signal arrived during the afternoon session. It cut through the diplomatic channels like a blade, raw and broken and full of static. It came from the Valen system, a cluster of small colonies on the far edge of Council space. The message was fragmented, but the words that came through were enough. An unknown fleet had attacked. Local defenses were overwhelmed. Civilians were dying. The council delegates reacted the way they always did. They argued. They debated jurisdiction. They formed emergency committees to discuss the formation of additional committees. Representatives from 3 different species claimed that the Valen system fell under their area of responsibility, and none of them could agree on what that responsibility actually required. Cole watched the debate for 20 minutes. Then he quietly stood up, left the chamber, and contacted Danny Price aboard the human frigate Steadfast, which was stationed near the border. Katie Grant met him in the corridor, with a datapad full of intelligence she had been collecting for weeks. The picture she painted was terrifying. The attacking fleet's energy signatures matched those of the Vraxian Horde, the same species the Council had classified as contained and no longer a threat. The signatures suggested a force far larger than anything in official Council projections. Cole requested permission from the Aethori Military Command to take a small reconnaissance group to the Valen system. The request was denied. The senior Aethori admiral told him that a proper response would be organized through Council channels, and that humans held an advisory role, not a command role. Ambassador Doran Hale, an Aethori diplomat who had never hidden his distaste for the human alliance, took the opportunity to publicly remind Cole of his place. Cole went anyway. He did not technically disobey orders. He filed the mission as a training exercise in the general area near the Valen system. The paperwork was so transparently false that everyone knew exactly what he was doing. But by the time anyone could formally object, the Steadfast and its 2 escort corvettes had already jumped to faster-than-light speed. When they arrived at Valen, Cole found a nightmare. 2 of the 3 inhabited worlds had already fallen. The skies above them were black with Vraxian ships, massive, organic-looking vessels covered in dark chitinous armor that pulsed with a sickly green light. They were enormous, some of them large enough to swallow the steadfast whole. The horde had descended on the colonies with overwhelming force and had torn through the local defense platforms like they were made of paper. Cole's small force had no chance in a direct fight. He knew that immediately. But he did not need to win the war. He needed to buy time. He studied the Vraxian formation and found what he was looking for: a supply line running through a nearby asteroid belt. The horde's forward ships were drawing energy and biological fuel from transport vessels that moved through the belt in regular intervals. Without that supply line, the advance would slow. Cole took the Steadfast and the 2 corvettes into the asteroid belt. For the next 18 hours, he ran a series of hit-and-run attacks against the supply transports. He used the asteroids as cover, darting out to strike and then disappearing back into the dense rock fields before the Vraxian warships could respond. He destroyed 9 supply vessels, damaged 14 more, and disrupted the entire logistical chain feeding the horde's front line. The Vraxian advance did not stop, but it slowed, and that was enough. On the third world of the Valon system, the surviving colonists had just enough time to begin emergency evacuation. Transports lifted off, carrying thousands of civilians who would have died if the horde had not been delayed. Cole brought his ships home. The Steadfast had taken heavy damage. One of the corvettes had lost its engine array and had to be towed. 3 of his crew were dead, and 20 more were wounded. But the mission was a success by any measure that mattered. The reception waiting for him at Calorith Station was not a celebration. The Galactic Council was furious. Cole had acted without authorization, violated chain of command, and embarrassed the senior Aethori admirals, who had been too slow to respond themselves. Doran Hale demanded formal censure, and argued that Cole should be stripped of his rank and sent back to Earth. But the military officers who reviewed his tactical data told a different story. What Cole had done in that asteroid belt was a textbook example of asymmetric warfare, using a tiny force to cripple a much larger enemy by targeting its weakest point. Most Council species understood the theory, but almost none of them had ever practiced it. Their wars had been fought between roughly equal powers, using established rules and formations. The idea of a handful of ships attacking a fleet of thousands and actually succeeding was not part of their experience. Velara watched all of this from the edges of the political storm. She saw her people scramble to take credit for the evacuation of the Valan colonists, while simultaneously trying to punish the man who made it possible. She watched Doran Hale twist words in the council chamber, and she watched the Aethori admirals quietly study Cole's battle recordings, with expressions that were not contempt anymore, but something closer to unease. That evening, for the first time since their bonding ceremony, Velara went to Cole and spoke to him about something real. She found him in their quarters, sitting by the window, looking out at the stars with the tired calm of a man who had not slept in 2 days. She asked him why he went to Valan when he knew the political cost. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he said that people were dying, and he had the means to help, and everything else was just noise. Velara did not respond right away. She sat down across from him and studied his face, the fatigue in his eyes, the small cut above his left brow that he had not bothered to treat, the absolute absence of regret in his expression. She had grown up, surrounded by politicians who weighed every action against its benefit. She had never met someone who weighed actions against whether people would live or die and then simply acted. She did not admire him yet, but the wall she had built between them developed its first crack. Later that night, Katie Grant called them both to a secure briefing room. She spread her intelligence across the display table and showed them what she had been piecing together for months. The Vraxian horde was not conducting border raids. It was launching a full invasion. The forces at Valan had been nothing more than an advanced scouting group. The main fleet numbering in the tens of thousands of warships, was massing in deep space beyond the outer rim. At current speed, it would reach Council territory in 6 months. The three of them sat in silence for a long time after Katie finished speaking. Then, Cole leaned forward, looked at the map of the approaching horde, and said that they had work to do. Velara looked at him and saw no fear in his eyes, none at all, and she wondered, for the first time, what kind of species could produce a man like that.